Thank you, Charu. So I'll get started here. I just wanted to say that I am, as Charu mentioned, my background is kind of focused on sample data, in particular biodiversity and species occurrence records. And I'm really actually excited to be working on standards for samples because I know they're essential for integrative work and improving the potential for data reuse. And these samples are really valuable. For example, in my work, I was looking at determining biological and environmental changes over time by combining data sets that were collected over different time periods. And for my PhD, I led an effort to digitize and integrate over 32,000 species occurrence records from a variety of sources over the past 200 years. So this took me about 4 years and the help of numerous undergraduate research assistants just to get the data. And it was part of a larger project to digitize natural history collections. But when we have standards, it enables us to more easily integrate similar data and evaluate and assess data quality, which is really important once you start combining data sets and using the data that others have collected, and providing the ability to link a variety of important data types, for example, by location and date. And the only way to maximize the value of our sample data is to publish it in a standardized format, including information that others would need to reuse the data 100 or 200 years from now. And that's what I hope that you'll think about as we're deciding on standards for this. And as we go through the webinar, just generally be thinking about your motivation to standardize sample identifiers and the metadata that go along with samples. We've set up a Google Doc to track some of your feedback that you may not be able to express during the webinar. And I copied the link for this in the Zoom comments, so you can find it there. I also provide a link to the sample metadata crosswalk that we have started. This is a draft linking IGSN field names that they provide in the template to other sample or other standards that involve sample metadata, which is something that we'll be working on. And then I also have a link to the slides. So in general, what do you want to be able to do with sample data online now and in the future? Maybe describe some of your potential use cases in the feedback document. How do you want to search for sample data? What fields do you want to be able to search on? And generally, what capabilities do you want to see in ESS-DIVE?
Joan, can you repost the link to the Google Doc, because some people logged on later and probably didn't get it.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Again in the chat.
Yeah, I was hoping someone else could do it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great.
So I copied it again in the chat. Let me know if you still can't see that.
That works. Thanks.
Okay. See here. As many of you know, we started on this path of standards for sample identifiers and metadata because numerous projects brought it up as a particular need. Sample tracking is particularly difficult for many of our large projects that are sending samples to numerous facilities for analyses and then combining various sets of samples into different data packages and publications. So we began research on this topic and came up with a draft proposal for ESS projects to use the International Geo Sample Number, or IGSNs, for their samples and the associated metadata standards for those. The IGSN is a globally unique and persistent identifier that was originally designed for geoscience samples, and there's efforts currently to make it a more general sample identifier that is relevant across even more sample types. They provide standardized core sample metadata and templates for this. There are a number of allocating agents, and the primary allocating agent that we would work with for this pilot test is the System for Earth Sample Registration, or SESAR. And they provide Excel templates online, and we've shared the white paper with you, and there is some detailed descriptions on the current process for registering IGSNs and updating sample metadata through SESAR, and we'll be thinking about ways to streamline this for ESS-DIVE in the future. But the primary benefit of using IGSN is the ability to link samples to other samples and to online metadata profiles that look something like this little box in the right corner here. So this is just a small excerpt of a sample metadata landing page for an individual sample that's on the SESAR sample catalog. And within this metadata, you can also provide links to other publications or photographs or links to other related samples. We also see value in being involved in this international community that's working towards building a global system of integrated and reusable sample data worldwide. There are IGSN allocating agent. There are 24 allocating agents for IGSN located around the world, and these include a variety of geological surveys, large data service providers, research organizations and national labs, and a number of universities. And there are currently over 7 million samples registered. It's kind of a growing system that people are becoming more and more aware of.
Joan, real quick, can you clarify what you mean by allocating agent?
Yes. So SESAR is one of the primary allocating agents, and they develop the IGSN system, and then each individual allocating agent is responsible for administering IGSNs for their community and for providing standardized sample metadata that is interoperable with the IGSN system.
So are you thinking that ESS-DIVE may become an allocating agent?
It is one option for us to work towards a DOE-specific or allocating agent for samples, but we're hoping to use the pilot test as a way to figure out if that makes sense for us or not, or if we want to go a different route. Because IGSN isn't the only option. As we're doing this, I mean, it is the primary readily available option, but it's possible that we could develop our own identifier and our own system that could be interoperable with IGSN, or maybe we want to stick with the IGSN and become an allocating agent in a member organization. It's kind of a community decision that we need to make as we go through the pilot test. To give you an idea of the sample types that are most often registered for IGSN through SESAR, this figure came out of their most recent newsletter, and it represents the object types on the left and the materials on the right that were registered through SESAR from February through April of 2019. It just gives you an idea of what are the most common material types. And we're focusing on IGSN because it's the only readily available option that's relevant for a wide variety of sample types that we deal with. But our goal is to develop a system that could be used with other identifiers and is interoperable with other standards that involve sample metadata that we deal with. But in general, community adoption of these sample data standards are necessary for implementing more advanced search capabilities for this data type in ESS-DIVE. And again, we do need your input on what capabilities that you would ideally like to see, which you can record in the Google Doc. Let's see. And so the first stage will likely be to index sample data in ESS-DIVE and Data 1, which would allow search for data sets that contain IGSN sample IDs or certain sample types or dates of individual samples and sample locations. We are also exploring what would be the best way to link related data in ESS-DIVE, for example, using metadata provided on sample relationships to create resource maps that link samples to other related entities like subsamples, data sets, and publications within ESS-DIVE. And the next step, which would likely take more time, is to implement sample data in the Fusion database. Our goal for the Fusion database is to allow advanced search within and across data sets, but to allow integrated search, we would join data with certain characteristics that you provide in your search and subset one or several archive data packages that meet the search criteria. So just integrating data for you based on your search criteria. And we want to know what you want to be able to search on in order to make some decisions on the capabilities that we would work on for ESS-DIVE. Overall, we hope that using IGSN or another standard globally unique and persistent identifier would have some immediate and future benefits for projects. This might include making the process of naming and tracking samples easier for projects that don't have a good system already. It would help avoid ambiguity and track the history of samples, provide a mechanism to link samples to other important identifiers, increase the discoverability of this kind of data, facilitate advanced searches, like I just discussed. And in the future, it'll be important to have a good way to cite and track data usage at the sample level if we're going to be aggregating certain data types and combining data from multiple data sets. So from here, I'd like to start to review some of our progress and goals for IGSN and sample metadata pilot tests that we're starting. So we're working with the community to develop and test a system that's interoperable for sample identification, tracking, and metadata standards. And so far, 5 project groups have committed to piloting IGSN and or sample metadata standards. We've met with most of these projects to determine the sample types that would be appropriate and start to map out relationships of sample features, samples, and subsamples that would be involved in the pilot test. And also our other major goal is to decide on collection metadata that's needed for starting with the first sample types that we're going to address in the pilot test. And IGSN in general is designed to be a general system for core sample metadata that's relevant across many different sample types. And it turns out that in many cases, we might need to extend some of the IGSN vocabularies and metadata fields to make them relevant and representative of our sample types and what we want to provide for our data sets. So we first started this process with the Slack SFA, which has begun registering and collecting samples, including gas and pore water, I believe. And let's see, this diagram shows some of the relationships that they started thinking about with their samples and what they were hoping to associate with IGSNs and a persistent identifier. But our goal overall is to fit IGSN and metadata collection into the planned field and lab workflows that people have. For the pilot test, we want to decide whether to keep using IGSN or to develop or adopt some other persistent identifier format. If for some reason IGSN isn't working for people. We also want to decide on the core metadata standards that should be required or encouraged across all sample types, and then to develop more specific samples for individual sample types.
And Joan, just to clarify, that's at the time of collection, not tracking it through all the various analysis. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the IGSN is really focused on the collection metadata, and the processing and QA/QC and analysis, all of that information would be kind of the next step.
Hey, Joan, will you go back to the previous slide related to what Chari was just bringing up? So I'm seeing like level 9 or 8, subsample for redox, subsample for extraction, RNA, DNA. The way it looks right there, it looks like there's like 9 different IGSN levels to the point of these very specific subsample types that are tied to specific types of analyses, which sounds different than what you just mentioned.
Well, it's kind of an open question how far we want to go in applying IGSNs. This was just kind of a draft schematic of the potential for applying IGSNs, but we aren't really convinced that we need to apply IGSNs at all these different levels. It's just a way to begin thinking about where to start with this and what makes the most sense. But it is an area that we would like feedback on.
I don't want to derail you. I'm just wondering, I'd love to hear from the Slack team, their experience so far. Maybe that's not today, but if they've sort of taken the plunge here, it'd be useful to hear from them.
Yeah, if you guys want to say anything about your experience so far, you're welcome to do that now, or we can talk about it later as well.
So, hi, this is Christine here. Actually, it's only been Zach that's been piloting this so far. So I don't know if Zach's on here, but if he is, it would be more helpful to hear directly from him.
Yeah, no, I'm on here. Were there, I guess, specific questions about this hierarchy or feedback? Do you think it's too deep, too structured?
This is James. I was just wondering, just to hear from your experience so far. I mean, if you're applying IGSNs all across this hierarchy, if you found that useful, has it been difficult? Are you making modifications from what's on the screen right now? Are you I'm just curious about your experience, really, how you feel about it.
Well, so I would say what I like about this hierarchy is that when you register an IGSN for a sample, there's a lot of metadata to fill out. And so if you're collecting a lot of samples, which right now we are with our weekly field collection of 50 to 100 pore water samples, it's so much easier just to register the parent IGSN for that sample, and then you get everything else imported automatically. The location of the well that it came from, the depth, the day that it was sampled, etc.
That sounds very useful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I should mention that right now, SESAR doesn't have, parent IGSN data isn't automatically populated into the child IGSN, but it's easy enough just to write a quick script to do that on your own computer before uploading the IGSN metadata info to SESAR. So
can I just add, is this essentially the data model here? I mean, if if we're exchanging IGSN objects, does this kind of transform into a, you know, a large nested JSON blob or something like that? Sorry, does that make sense? I'm just wondering what this hierarchy actually represents. Is it more just a kind of conceptual overview, or?
Yeah, it's just a conceptual overview. So right now within IGSN, the only mechanism that you provide to link samples is to provide the parent IGSN for every sample that you register. And you don't have to register all these different levels. You could just focus on samples and subsamples. I guess one of the potential capabilities that we could think about for ESS-DIVE, I don't know if we are making any promises right now with this, but is to work on a resource map that uses these parent-child relationships to show how all of these different identifiers are related, and that could include linking to data sets and publications as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
So we're starting with this simple system to see if it works, like simply providing a parent identifier, or if we might need some more detail.
Can I just clarify? So I think what Zach was saying there, if you have a IGSN number and say it's down at this level 9, and you if I put that number into the IGSN system or the SESAR system, it'll tell me like, oh, that's an RNA subsample from sediment on this date at that depth from this location at that site that's tied to the SLAC SFA.
Yeah, it will take you to the sample metadata landing page, which will provide all of the data that you gave them. So you might not give them all of that information, but whatever you do give them will be in that sample metadata landing page. And that includes links to other publications and to other samples.
And so the reverse, if you go and I have an IGSN number that takes me to location 10-6, does it tell me all the children?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so. But you have to make sure that that information is in your metadata.
Yeah, Zach, it'd be interesting to see your script, how you wrote a script to do this automatically somehow.
Yeah, I mean, the way that you update data with the IGSN system is that you just have an Excel file with rows of samples or sites or whatever is being registered, and then the columns are the individual metadata categories. And so it's pretty simple, just reading that in as a CSV to whatever program you want, and then pulling from each level in this hierarchical map will have its own CSV file or Excel file with all the sites, and so it's really easy to pull in recursively all the parent info for an individual sample and populate that sample's metadata. I don't know, does that make sense?
Sort of. For me, at least, it'd be, I'm not saying we can do this right now, but it'd be super useful and interesting to sort of see you walk through that. I think I know what you mean, but it's a little bit different just to sort of see the documents and whatnot. But I don't want, I'm sorry, Joan, I know I'm sort of derailing what you're trying to do.
No, not at all. We want to get feedback and answer all the questions that you guys have. We can also continue this conversation later, and so I guess in general, we want to have, that's something to put in the feedback form, like what capabilities you want to be able to do, like have a resource map that shows all of the relationships. But I'll move on from there, and we can come back to it if we need to. So for piloting IGSN, we we have met with most of the projects like I mentioned, and here's a list of some of the sample types that the different projects are testing out in the pilot test and using IGSN. I won't go through all of these, but just you can take a look and get an idea of the variety that we might be working with. So we also want to think about how we'll evaluate the pilot test, and if you have any thoughts on this, you can indicate that in the Google Doc. But in general, we want to know whether IGSN is a good approach, or if we might want to explore a more customized persistent identifier. Just we're thinking about how much extra effort does it require to register IGSNs through SESAR. Did IGSN improve the ability to track samples or have any other immediate benefits? Are there future benefits that you can see? Are we able to track samples effectively using this parent-child relationship, or is it better to use a related identifier and indicate a specific relation type? And is the resulting sample data more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable? So those are some of the general things that I've been thinking about as ways to evaluate IGSN in this pilot test. And then from here, I wanted to open it up a little bit. I'd like to go through some of the core sample metadata elements that that IGSN has designated as kind of a kernel that is relevant across all sample types. And this kind of information includes an identifier, which in this case would be an IGSN. Within the IGSN system, you also provide your own sample name, which can be anything that you want it to be. You provide a sample or object and material type, and these are based on controlled fields. IGSN has controlled fields for these, and we may need to extend some of the terms for our sample types. So that's something to think about as you begin, for those of you who are involved in the pilot test as you're going through this, and that would be one important feedback. There's also a general sample description option that is a free form, anything that you want to include in there about the sample to describe it. We definitely want location information, which could include the name and then coordinates. But for coordinates, we really will need a standardized way, a standardized format, which should likely be the WGS 84 decimal degrees. Many projects may also want to provide elevation as part of their location information. There's collector, of course. We can have name or an ORCID to have it be more standardized. We will likely also need a project name, which for our community could be a controlled field. A collection date and time in a standardized format, a collection method. In IGSN, they have a controlled field for collection method, which how I have looked at it, that's another area where I think we may need some additional terms, and in addition to what the SESAR IGSN has for this vocabulary. There's also a field that allows for a free form description of your collection method to provide more details. And then we have a way to indicate sample relationships. So the current system of IGSN is focused on providing a parent identifier for every registered IGSN, but I believe that they are working to a more updated system where they might move toward providing a related identifier field and then indicating a relation type. That's not what we're going to do right now, because that's not what the current system is, but just so that you are aware of that and think about if that could make more sense for tracking sample relationships. And for the parent-child relationship, the relation type, I believe, is derived from or something like that. I'll have to the relation type is a controlled field. There's also a mechanism to provide supplemental metadata and data, just providing a link to other records. So in general, I wanted to know which of these fields should be required or potentially excluded, or are there any other essential metadata elements that you think we might want to consider including? And this again is elements that would be relevant across all sample types. Is there anything else that you can think of in looking at that? And you can bring that up now or enter it into the feedback form as well.
So, Joan, this is Chris Mungle here from EGSB. This is just the core types. So this would be an extensible list. So, for example, if you have a soil sample and you want to record the various soil geochemical properties and so on, you'd still be able to do that.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's the next discussion, like what you need for individual sample types. Does anyone have any thoughts on what might be needed across all sample types? Okay. Well, if you do have any, I provided the link to the.
Can I ask something real quick? Sorry.
Yes.
Does metadata, will that include a photograph, especially of a core sample? That'd be quite useful.
Yes. And you can provide links to photographs as well,
Is there any chance it can be listed with all of this information just to encourage people to definitely take a photograph?
I don't think that we would. I think most people don't collect photographs, or a lot of them wouldn't. So I don't think that we would want that to be a required field, but definitely an optional field for projects that want to be able to do that. And you can do that within the SESAR system.
Okay.
I think I missed this. When you say core sample metadata, do you mean a physical like soil core, or do you mean the essential sample metadata?
What I mean by that is sample metadata that can be applied across all sample types, but that is confusing. It's just a term that is used. And then this is the template, the SESAR template, and this is what it would look like if it only included those fields that are applicable across all sample types. There are quite a few other fields that you can provide for IGSN, and this is kind of narrowed down to those that I presented on the last slide. It's just an Excel template.
You may have mentioned this. Did you mention for the collection time, the time zone?
That is part of the ISO standard for providing date and time information. We can go back. So you can include it. It's not in this format, but that's a good point. We should add that as an option.
I thought ISO was related to the UTC, so you convert it all to UTC.
What UTC?
So you go back to 0 longitude, so it's all converted to the same time zone. And so that way you don't have to worry about daylight savings time and things too, because some places do that and some places don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as part of this, we would provide some detailed descriptions of the standard and what would be required for that.
Going back to what was just mentioned, that seems very useful to me, to have everyone just use the same, if it's the UTC, like that's just the standard. Mm-hmm. It seems great.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there's some more things to think about. I'll just mention it briefly, and then we're going to move on to a discussion on how we might be able to use, or whether or not community funds should or could be used for this, and Deb is going to talk about that. But I just want to mention that we're working on making this interoperable across standards, and I've listed some standards here that we're thinking about now. So if you have any input on additional standards to look at, please let us know in the feedback form. And it's we also have the metadata crosswalk link in the chat as well, which shows how we're starting on this. We'll be thinking about how to characterize sample types using IGSN vocabularies and additional terms, and then also metadata elements and terms that we'll need for specific sample types. And then the next stage is going to be to look at fields we'll need for sample data processing, QA, QC, and analysis, and that's another stage of this work. And I'll let Deb talk about the community funds now. Deb, are you there?
I am, but Chara is controlling the laptop, so she had to unmute. So my current assumption is that we're not in need of community funds to support this sample ID work. But now that you've heard more where we're at and where things are going, I want to open the floor to people refuting that. If we need to reconsider our assumptions here. And part of why I'm thinking that way is because I feel like we're already ready and doing a lot of the testing, etc. And so most of the need for projects to spend effort on this is in the next couple of months. And I can't get anybody funds that fast. So a piece of it is pragmatic. And a piece of it is that we have enough players in this that to be fair and give it to everybody really isn't practical, because I can't do that many subcontracts. Our subcontracting office would just about shoot me. And so that's why I'm currently sitting on that assumption. I'm going to now shut up and let anybody who needs to speak up and let me know if I'm wrong in how I'm thinking about this.
This is James. I would just concur with what you were saying, for what that's worth.
All right, so I'm gonna assume at least nobody could think of a reason in the short term. So it's not that I'm not open to it, you know, that answer changing. But I feel like right now, at least on the sample IDs and metadata, you know, as we heard, I mean, Joan has been dedicated to this effort for a fair amount of time. And I think we've got it sort of, you know, headed in the right direction. I'm hoping you all think so now that you all talked through where we're at and what are next. I'm not closing off that funds couldn't be used. I'm just saying at the moment, I don't see a way that this makes sense. So we can have further discussions if something comes up. And one of the things that's clearly obvious to me is if there is some value in us looking at setting up a means by which we can get like sample labels and things uniformly through the same method or things like that. And I need to cough up some money to help make that happen. I'm perfectly open to that as being what we do in the community funds, as long as the lab and Jay don't disallow it. So we can think more broadly than just FTE effort that I could fund here if needed. But I think unless there's other questions or discussion, I'm going to open it back up to the discussion with Joan about where we're going next on the sample metadata.
And just to be clear, this is about sample metadata, not about the data standards associated with the data that's coming off analysis of the samples, which is a different topic.
Hey, Joan, this is Roloff. From my understanding, and I may be wrong, is that the IGSN is supposed to be used in parallel with an internal institutional sample ID or tracking schema. So that it's not, at least the way I've heard it described by Kirsten, Len, and other people, it's not used as a primary, but more as a, as a sort of a secondary schema for distributing data. But you're still having, people would still use their internal like LIMS architecture for tracking sample IDs. Is that correct, or is the current proposal that IGSN would basically be your universal sample ID?
No, that is correct in the SESAR system, in that one of the required fields for registering IGSN is the sample name. And then the IGSN itself is the mechanism to track those samples online and link back to the original sample metadata landing page and link to other persistent identifiers. I believe it would be a good mechanism to use in parallel with the sample name in tracking samples across facilities as well, because it is a persistent identifier and there's no, we wouldn't change it, and it's globally unique.
Okay, that agrees with my understanding. But basically, the sample name. So to give a specific question, say somebody collects a sample in the field, they would use the sample name for data collection and analysis, and then at some moment they would say, okay, by the way, this sample is associated with its IGSN number, but in the analysis phase, they would still use their internal like sample name.
Yes, well, and I mean, the IGSN should always be associated with that sample name. And it's up to the individual projects on how they want to manage that. But that would certainly be a logical way to do it, particularly if sample names contain certain elements that help you in the way you do analysis.
So Roloff, let me add to Joan's answer. I completely agree with Joan's answer, but I do want to make the point that the critical element of why we're going to this universal sample ID is so that all of the analyses, all of the steps of the sample can be tracked together. And so there are a lot of risks if you're doing all of the other work, all the analysis, all of everything, not referring to the IGSN and not carrying it through with that, then you run a very high risk that all of that data is not well tied to that universal identifier. And that's a danger that I'm very concerned about. And so yes, the system is designed so you can do that, because enough of the groups already had existing other sample approaches, other built-in things to their systems they couldn't just change. But to consider that to be the preferred method is maybe a little bit strong. I would say actually it's enabled, but it's not necessarily preferred, because you do run this risk that that ID, it becomes a real nightmare for somebody to track back to figure out which IGSN that analysis actually refers to. So I would give that caveat.
This is Chris Mungle again. It might be useful to have amongst the core metadata elements a field so that you can track other identifiers in other systems, be that some local limbs, but also it may also, the same sample may also exist in, you know, a biosample database as well, for example.
And I'll expand on that a little bit to say that, like, I know there are already existing ways of assigning samples when they get to, say, JGI or MSOL. KBase is talking about having an identifier assigned to samples when stuff comes in there as well. And so it'd be useful to be able to sort of link those all together somewhere. And it's not really clear to me right now where that somewhere is.
Yeah, we have had, as you know, discussions with some individuals from different user facilities. And one of the ideas that came out of that is to work on a centralized DOE sample management system. That's not within the scope of ESS-DIVE, but and we believe that would take quite a while to spin up and do. But it is something that people have expressed interest in.
Yeah, we have been talking with KBase, MSIL, and JGI about this. And one thing under consideration is for the persistent identifier to be issued by OSTI. But all of that is going to take a while. And we just wanted to get started on something practical. So, and I think everybody from the different facilities that we had conversation with were appreciative of the fact that we're doing this pilot test, because this will help us learn a lot of things that that need to be considered when we're starting to design all these crosstalk between facilities and sample ID. So everybody was just like, let's see what's coming out of this pilot test, and then we could sort of, you know, move ahead with our conversations. So a lot of folks are excited about it.
Eli here from Brookhaven. With the sample name and the ISGN number, is it possible for them to be the same and avoid having two parallel systems in cases where it suits the project?
Sorry, I had a hard time hearing that. But was the question if the IGSN could be the same as the sample name?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, okay. It was just a little quiet. So yeah, you can, if a particular project has sufficiently unique sample names already, one option is to add the, so every user is assigned a user code. So an option is to add the user code to as a prefix of your sample name and make that be your IGSN. So that is one option that is currently available within the system. But it requires that your names be truly unique.
Yep, okay, that's good.
Does anyone have any other comments or anything that you'd like to discuss that we brought up but didn't have a chance to talk more thoroughly on?
So for some of the controlled fields, at the moment, I think IGSN has a controlled vocabulary of about 50 or so different terms. Is the proposal that we could extend that here? And how would that work in terms of like if it was also submitted to SESAR? Would, you know, if we used a more granular vocabulary, would it be rolled up to the IGSN terms?
We would definitely have that discussion with them, and they're open to it. And I've been communicating fairly frequently with Kirsten Leonard So that would be the goal.
Okay.
But we also want to keep it as we're developing our own system. So the IGSN has a lot of fields that are not relevant for people, for our community. So we want to kind of eliminate those from the template when people are doing this, to make it.
Would you have separate templates for different communities as we have in the mixes standards?
I think that the overall goal would be to have a list of core sample metadata, like as I presented, and then have additional metadata that we work with people on that are related to specific sample types. Mm-hmm. So I think the goal would be to have the core metadata template and then have add-ons for different sample types, and those would include required information and kind of nice to know information. Mm-hmm.
A question on the core metadata list. The time of sample collection is something that is not necessarily routinely currently recorded. Is that seen as something that really has to be in the core metadata?
No, and let's see. It wouldn't need to be a required field, because yeah, you're right. A lot of people don't record the time, so it would be kind of, I guess, a field that would be optional. But
the ISO can be defined with just a date if you don't have the time. So it's the hours, minutes, second can be left blank, and it would still work as a date-time field.
Mm-hmm. And in the IGSN template, they actually have it separated. The date and the time are two different fields. Are there any other questions or thoughts before we end? We're about out of time. Okay, well, if you do have any additional comments, and if it would be great if you could look at the feedback and see if you can provide, if there's any information that you would like to provide on the questions listed about what you want to see in ESS-DIVE in relation to sample metadata and data, and your thoughts on some of the required and required fields and other fields that might be nice to know, and then also fields that might be related to specific sample types. It would be great to start getting some feedback documented, and we can continue to have discussions about this as we go forward. So I guess with that, just thank you everyone for participating in this, and we'll continue to be in touch.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.